And he is really one of the leaders in pediatric epilepsy. He particularly focuses on research in infantile spasms, and more recently has been involved with many key clinical trials in the treatment of really severe and refractory epilepsies. As you see from the title of his talk, he's going to focus on CBD, in part because that's an area of great interest in our field right now, and in part because he's actually one of the folks who's really at the is taking a leadership role in really studying CBD in a way that will help us decide who we should be treating with this agent, since many people are already actually using it. So he's already published some nice papers in this area, and I'm sure we'll continue to do more. But I just wanted to emphasize that he is overall a pediatric epilepsy specialist, and so if after the talk there are other questions around epilepsy, I will be here as well to field questions, but he can answer other questions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Sean. And Sean, so you can't see the audience, but I think, can he hear them if they have? Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so we'll give you a signal. For some reason we can't hear you, but otherwise we'll let you have the stage.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for that kind introduction. So we'll be talking about Cannabidiol in the treatment of pediatric epilepsy. And first, my industry disclosures. So I've done quite a bit of work with a variety of pharmaceutical companies that are developing therapies for infantile spasms. And the one to pay attention to would be GW Pharma and Synthesis Therapeutics, that they are leading the way in the development of Cannabidiol. So first, a few basics. This may not be news to many of you, but epilepsy is pretty common. It affects about 1 to 2% of the population, and incidence or the onset of epilepsy is most common in the first year of life. Our therapies are decent, meaning that about 2/3 of people are controlled with available therapies, but still 1/3 of patients are still uncontrolled despite our best efforts.
Okay, so this is an image that is probably familiar to a lot of people, but this is a child having a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. And as you can see, this is pretty obvious. The reality, though, is that many seizures come in different flavors, so to speak, and that many of them are more subtle. And here's an example of infantile spasms, and this is the form of epilepsy that is of greatest interest to me and the focus of my research. It is also a form of epilepsy that is common among children with duplication 15q. And what you're seeing are relatively subtle events in a cluster, just like this. And what is paradoxical is that these more subtle or milder seizures are associated with bigger cognitive consequences when they are unsuccessfully treated. And the reason is because of what you see on this screen. This looks pretty chaotic, and these are brainwaves that you see in infantile spasms. This is a pattern called hypsarrhythmia, and it is essential in treating this disorder that you get rid of this. And this is a side-by-side demonstration of what normal brainwaves look like and hypsarrhythmia, and you can see that they're pretty different. Now, the best case scenario when it comes to infantile spasms is that children can be normal, that if their underlying cause of epilepsy is something fairly benign, and that if you can quickly control seizures and stop hypsarrhythmia, those kids can be normal or near normal. And that is the situation for only about 25% of kids with infantile spasms. The opposite is the worst case scenario. And this means that every good function of your brain is vulnerable to being harmed by the epilepsy. And this includes everything from vision, hearing, motor movement, language, judgment, decision-making. Everything you can imagine your brain doing is at risk when you have bad forms of epilepsy, forms of epileptic encephalopathy, and disorders like infantile spasms, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, to a lesser extent, Dravet syndrome. And in addition to those cognitive consequences, we worry about increased risk of autism associated with epilepsy, with lifelong seizures of other types, and even a risk of death, something we refer to as SUDEP, or sudden unprovoked death in epilepsy, still an entity that is poorly understood. And if I can't appeal to you on a compassionate basis, let me appeal to your wallet. The direct costs in terms of just providing health care are approximately $7 million per patient when you look at patients who have failed therapy and are devastated by their epilepsy. And this is even dwarfed by the indirect costs. The impact on parents, their work productivity, their employment, their use of healthcare utilization. And this is about $23 billion per year in the United States in 2015 dollars. So when you think about infantile spasms, you'd like to think that the menu is vast, something like California Pizza Kitchen here, but it's not. It actually looks like this. It's pretty simple. There are only a couple therapies that are known to work in a highly effective fashion. And in this case, it's ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, and another drug called vigabatrin. And you can see that the costs are not cheap. There's $150,000 per course. Vigabatrin, depending on a child's size, is about $60,000 per course. So when you think about these two therapies, they are unfortunately not effective all the time. And in the case of vigabatrin, it's only effective about a third of the time. The side effects are fairly gruesome. When you think about ACTH, there is a risk of death from immunosuppression. There is a risk of potentially fatal heart failure from high blood pressure. And vigabatrin has been linked to vision loss. So I can imagine being a parent and looking at this side effect menu and not being too happy about it. And as we mentioned, the costs are quite high. But let's take a little time out and talk about risk. So I've listed a few medications here that are often used in highly refractory or uncontrolled pediatric epilepsy. And when you Google each of these, a few things come immediately to your attention. So for ACTH, because of immunosuppression, there is a risk of fatal infection. For vigabatrin, there is a risk of vision loss, which is often misconstrued as complete blindness. Valproic acid, or Depakote, is associated with fatal liver failure. Felbamate, similarly, is associated with fatal liver failure. Lamotrigine, or Lamictal, is associated with a rash called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which also can be fatal. And I think when you see these linkages, it's impossible not to take these to heart, and this is kind of what we remember when we simply look up a medication online. But as practitioners, what we try to do is we try to put these risks in perspective. And this is a graph showing the kind of the risk of these bad side effects for each drug. And you can see for ACTH, you can barely see the column here, and that's because the risk of death with ACTH is something like 1 in 300 exposures, which is hard to see on this graph. And that risk is probably even lower with new treatment regimens. With vigabatrin, we believe that the risk of meaningful vision loss is under 5%. And with Depakote, Felbamate, and Lamictal, the risk of bad side effects with each of those is so small that you can't even see it on this graph. And then the further thing to think about is, what is the risk if you don't use the medication, or what is the risk that the medication won't work? And unfortunately, these bars are quite high. And what I want to highlight is that the risk of any of these drugs, the biggest risk is that they won't work. And then you have to think about, what is the risk if you don't use one of these therapies? When we think about infantile spasms, this figure, 99%, that is the odds that infantile spasms will continue if you don't do anything for 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, there's approximately a 1% chance that they'll stop by themselves. Okay, but going back to this menu, wouldn't it be nice if there was a third drug that was highly effective, that didn't have any terrible side effects, and that didn't carry a 5 to 6 figure price tag? Absolutely. And one possibility is that drug number 3 is a cannabis derivative, or cannabidiol. Okay, so let's do a little bit of cannabis basics. There are two specific species, Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. The two plants look pretty different. The sativa is a tall plant. The indica is short and stout. There are similarities in their leaves, but the sativa is long and skinny, short and stout leaves for indica. This is a marijuana cigarette, or a joint. This is a marijuana cigar, or a blunt. And we're not talking about these today. There are lots of edibles. I am told, I have no personal experience, but I'm told that the lemon shortbread tart is wonderful. Now, believe it or not, some of these products are being used for treatment of pediatric epilepsy, and I don't recommend this approach. And the plant cannabis is also used for a whole bunch of other things, especially varieties of the plant that are low in THC, that are classified as hemp. These are being used as fabric, as paper, twine, even biofuel. And a lot of times when we think of medical marijuana dispensaries, we imagine something like this. Or if you're in Southern California, this is a picture from Venice. This is modern day. But But more and more, dispensaries are looking like this. They are much more high-end. They are appealing to a wealthier and more sophisticated clientele. And what you don't see in this picture is the armed guard. So medical marijuana and recreational marijuana are still federally illegal, and dispensaries and growers can't use the banking system. So it's very much a cash-only business, and that carries some risk. Okay, so a little bit of history of cannabis. We believe that it probably started in what is now China, and that it kind of made its way to the West after thousands of years. And when we think about original use of cannabis, it probably began in China for use of things like nausea 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And the first report of use for something that resembles epilepsy was probably in the Middle East at approximately 1000 AD. It came to the West in the 1800s for things like pain control and analgesia. And today, as you know, it is being touted for use in everything. This is a great picture of the California flag, slightly modified. And as you know, in last November, in the ballot, a bill authorizing recreational use was approved, and that will go into effect in 2018. And these slides are already outdated, but the theme is that in recent years there's been a dramatic transition such that most states have provisions for medical marijuana, or specifically cannabidiol products, or even recreational use. But still, the entire country, throughout all of the United States, the federal laws dictate that it is still illegal. So there's a huge contradiction between most states and the federal government as to how cannabidiol and marijuana are viewed. Looking globally, you can see that most countries do not have, country-wide provisions for medical marijuana or recreational marijuana, except according to the Huffington Post, you can see that North Korea is apparently legal. And if this is true, I suspect that this is Dennis Rodman diplomacy, but that's unconfirmed. Okay, so things really changed in 2013 when we saw the first of a trio of documentaries called Weed, and these were put on by CNN and Sanjay Gupta. And this was a venue in which he changed his mind. He changed his stance from being anti-marijuana to a more nuanced stance of recognizing that there may be medical benefit with marijuana. And among others, they profiled the experience of many patients with a variety of neurological disorders, but chiefly epilepsy, and chiefly pediatric epilepsy, and in particular, one specific type called Dravet syndrome. This is a pretty terrible type of epilepsy. It's very difficult to control. The treatment options are quite limited and relatively high risk. And this little girl has Dravet syndrome. Her name is Charlotte. And Sanjay Gupta profiled her experience with a extract from a cannabis plant that now bears her name. It's called Charlotte's Web. It's made by this photogenic band of brothers. They are the face of the realm of caring. And the product they make is distributed by Charlotte's Web Botanicals, and it is termed a hemp extract because of its cannabidiol content and low THC content. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But this is not the only game in town. There are many competitors available in dispensaries, online, and in other venues, even on Amazon. Some of these products are unfortunately marketed to look like candy. This one is particularly distressing. When you open it up, it looks a little bit like a Tootsie Roll. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this plant. So the chemical in marijuana that gives the side effects that we know, or the effects that we know, is called THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol. And those effects include euphoria, or the high that is accompanied with the use of marijuana in some cases, hunger or anti-nausea effects, paranoia or unmasking of psychosis, and the so-called amotivational syndrome. And in contrast to this, we have a very similar looking molecule known as cannabidiol, or CBD, and it doesn't have any of those effects, but it instead has the potential, we hope, to be an anti-seizure drug, and that it may cause some sedation, it may cause anorexia or diarrhea in some cases. But we have to remember that there are hundreds or over 100 other chemicals present in the plant, and it's not clear what effect or effects those chemicals have. So these are images of receptors in the brain and elsewhere in the body. These are where at least THC binds in the body. This is called CB1 and CB2, or cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors. This is what it looks like in an individual neuron. These are transmembrane proteins. And these are cannabinoids that are normally present in the body. And what is interesting is that they bear almost no structural resemblance to cannabinoids found in plants. And in short, from these slides, I'll tell you that we don't know what cannabidiol does, but it does not work through the same receptors as THC. Okay, so when you look online and ask people, does cannabis work for seizures? You get a lot of positivity that it's working great, there are no side effects, it's a miracle, and only rarely will you find someone that says that it didn't work. But if you were instead to be a fly on the wall in my pediatric epilepsy clinic, you would hear that it doesn't work, that it doesn't work, that it doesn't work. And only rarely you'll hear that it did work. So how do we reconcile these two very different viewpoints of effectiveness? The way we went about this was to survey people online. We conducted a relatively large international survey of parents who were using cannabis extracts to treat their children's epilepsy. And what we found, maybe not surprisingly, was that it was highly effective for infantile spasms and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, with upwards of 90% of parents reporting a benefit and 13% of parents reporting seizure freedom, often achieved within 2 or 3 weeks. We saw a similar pattern for Dravet syndrome, also known as severe myoclonic epilepsy of infancy. And for all other types of epilepsy, we saw the same pattern, that it was working across the board. And then in a very different approach, Craig Press and colleagues at the Children's Hospital of Colorado looked at patients who presented to their emergency room, and they separated patients by whether they were Colorado natives or whether they had come from other states or other countries in their attempt to access these products, as Colorado was certainly at the forefront of both medical and recreational marijuana. And what they saw was that among Colorado natives, the response rate was about 20%. But when they looked at patients who had immigrated, so to speak, to Colorado, they saw that the response rate was more than double. And I would tell you that it's probably not the elevation, that this reflects some degree of bias, such that folks who are most in need of an effective therapy, who are most desperate, are also most likely to see benefit in any therapy, whether or not it's truly effective. So let's transition a little bit and talk about some risks of these products. We'll keep going with a little bit of the evidence. So, our evidence for the effectiveness of Cannabidol is not limited to simply Sanjay Gupta. There are a variety of sources of what we call basic science, or experiments in test tubes and experiments in models of epilepsy in rats and mice, suggesting that it's quite effective. And this was seen in a variety of models of epilepsy. And it was also seen to be pretty well tolerated. So this contraption is called a rotorod. And what you can see is that these rats have been given Cannabidol, and they are not falling off of this spinning cylinder. But when you give them conventional anti-seizure medications like Dilantin, that they do fall off of this thing. So it's evidence at least that Cannabidol has a decent side effect profile, at least in rats. The hottest evidence came in May of this year in a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a very high-profile publication internationally. And it was the first randomized controlled trial published describing the effect of Cannabidol in Dravet syndrome. And what they saw, it was not a miracle, but they did see that there was a statistically significant benefit, such that patients who were receiving Cannabidol had approximately a 40% reduction in their seizures, whereas those who were receiving placebo had about a 13% reduction in seizures. And this is pretty good. This is certainly about as good as what we see with conventional medications in similarly designed clinical trials. And perhaps of a big testament to the study is that Dravet syndrome is difficult to treat, and it is harder to show that any conventional drug is effective in this population. So this was quite promising. The catch, though, is that 2/3 of the patients were taking a drug called clobazam, also known as Onfi. And there is an interaction between Cannabidol and clobazam, such that if you have clobazam on board, your blood levels of clobazam might skyrocket when you take Cannabidol. But this is inconsistent. And the consequence here is that it may increase the effectiveness or perceived effectiveness of Cannabidol and might also increase the side effects. So when we see positive experiences with cannabidiol in a patient who is also taking Onfi, we have to wonder that the effectiveness might be due to rising blood levels of Onfi, and that if there are any side effects reported, that those side effects might not be due to cannabidiol, but they might be due to Onfi instead. And similarly, this picture looks very similar, but this was for, so this is Dravet syndrome. And when we look at this chart, perhaps some of that benefit was due to clobazam, and that's where I've shown it in red. So maybe cannabidiol isn't as effective as we hope. Perhaps it's not effective. Here is a similar projection of the effect in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. This, however, is unpublished, and these data were derived from a press release, not a peer-reviewed study. But in short, the same effect might be going on. And when you look at the development of cannabidiol in the pharmaceutical sphere, this is what we see, that there are trials ongoing or completed for Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, tuberous sclerosis, infantile spasms. And the potential approval is closest for Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut, but is by no means a done deal. So in sum, we have a variety of data, some of it low quality, some of it high quality, but we still don't have any definitive evidence of effectiveness, safety, and tolerability. So we are certainly looking to expand on that. When we think about all of the products that we've described, when we think about wild-type cannabis or cannabis that might have been around in China, 12,000 years ago, it appeared to have an equal mix of THC and CBD. And that has changed over time. So recreational marijuana that we see is especially rich in THC, that's in the red. Same is true of most medical marijuana today. And this is the exact opposite of the CBD or cannabidiol-enriched extracts like Charlotte's Web. Those are very much rich in CBD and have relatively small amounts of THC, but they are not free of THC. And when you look at the pharmaceutical products in development by GW Pharma and Insys, these are almost exclusively CBD or pure CBD, we like to say. So let's talk about risks. We alluded to this a little bit before. So first and foremost, when you think about community extracts, there's a lot of uncertainty as to the consistency of these products. Now, if you get a product this month, is it going to be the same next month? Will it be the same amount of cannabidiol? Will there be the same amount of THC? Will there be the same amount of approximately 100 other chemicals? We think about generic anti-seizure drugs. We worry about generic to generic variation that might sacrifice seizure control or lead to side effects. The variation that we've seen with CBD-enriched extracts dwarfs that variation, that we will see products that month to month might have twice as much CBD or no CBD the next month. So this presents a big problem, obviously, and this is also why a lot of practitioners are aware of these products. We also don't know what the shelf life of these products are. There's a big difference between what we observe and what is advertised by manufacturers and growers and distributors. Another big problem is how you test the product. There's no good way to do this, but there are ways. So, for example, this is the website of a company called The Workshop, and they kind of cater to patients using medical marijuana in the effort to know your medicine, quote unquote. And what they do is do some testing of your product. They'll take a sample of 5 or 10 milliliters, charge you about $100, and they'll generate a report that looks like this. And I'll zoom in here, and they'll tell you which cannabinoids are in this product. And you can see here, this particular product had 15.69 milligrams per gram of CBD and less than 1 milligram per gram of THC. And this was a product that had a ratio of about 18 to 1. So this would be a way to verify that, yes, this product had mostly CBD, very little THC. And for an extra charge, you can look for contaminants like bacteria or mold or pesticides or solvents used in the extraction of cannabinoids. Now, the ideal would be to test every single batch, every single bottle of these products to verify that there are not substantial variations from month to month and to verify that the product can deliver the same dose month to month. But this is expensive and difficult. It's not always feasible. This was a letter to the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the lab that we showed in the last website had done an interesting study where they looked at a variety of edible products in California, Seattle, and Colorado. And they saw that there were substantial differences between what was reported to be in these edible products and what was measured by the lab. This same very lab was shut down temporarily when they were accused of manufacturing cannabis products. So these labs are maybe a good resource to patients and parents, but it's not clear how legal they are. Now, aside from quality risk, there are medical risks. Foremost, although there are a number of studies on cannabidol out these days, we still don't have great safety data. And that sort of data you only can get from treating thousands and thousands of patients with these products and keeping close track of them to make sure that they haven't had an untoward side effect. The other big issue is drug interactions, of which there are many. This is a demonstration of drug interactions with other anti-seizure drugs. But as we had discussed before, the biggest one of concern is with Onfi. And this is because of an interaction in the liver. These are effects on other anti-seizure drugs. There are also a variety of drugs for other medical problems that are impacted, things like blood thinners, antidepressants, drugs for blood pressure. Several other drugs will impact the blood level of cannabidiol, things like aspirin, common steroids, several other anti-seizure drugs. So there are a lot of potential interactions, and the message here is that you have to be aware of those interactions and that you need to tell your practitioners if you or your child is on one of these products, because they need to know about a potential impact on other therapies, other drugs, and other things that could impact health. And lastly, there are, of course, legal risks, from a federal standpoint that impact all medical marijuana, all recreational marijuana, including these cannabidiol products. I would say that arrest and imprisonment is exceptionally uncommon, and that in general, law enforcement are not targeting the parents of children with severe epilepsy who are in a desperate battle to gain control. That is certainly not their target. But there have certainly been cases in which healthcare providers at certain institutions have not taken a nuanced view. There have been many occasions in which child protective services have been called, and that's a risk, and you got to be aware of it. So the DEA still has a very strict, unnuanced view of medical marijuana. They define it not as medicine, that there is only abuse potential, no established medical benefit. I would say that this is in conflict with available data, but it is still a law. The federal standpoint is that all cultivation and distribution is still illegal, and there is great uncertainty about the extent to which this will be enforced in the future. There are conflicting messages from the current administration. So, in an interesting bipartisan effort, this is Senator Rand Paul and Cory Booker, a libertarian and a liberal who teamed up in a rare instance to promote something called the CARES Act. And the idea was to establish an avenue for greater access to research and to specifically gain approval for cannabidiol products. But this died. I think leniency on marijuana is still fairly unpopular, especially among much of the electorate. So what do we need to do? We need quite a bit. We need much better research, much more research. We need to identify the best disease targets, like types of epilepsy. We need to figure out how cannabidiol works, if it works. And there may be other cannabinoids besides cannabidiol that might be as effective or more effective, or that might be safer, or that may be delivered to the brain easier. We got to figure this out. The other big thing is we have to change the legal landscape so that research is easier. Right now I can count on, unfortunately, one finger the number of people who are running active clinical trials for cannabidiol in infantile spasms in the United States. Not one hand, it's on one finger. And we have to engage our legislatures to get on our side. A lot of these things, advocacy, clinical trials, observational studies, they are happening at UCLA and a variety of institutions across the country. And this is growing, luckily, but it's not progressing fast enough. And as many of you in the audience know, this research couldn't happen fast enough. Okay, so let's transition and try to give a little bit of guidance for parents who are considering a cannabinoid product. Number one, you've got to kind of press the reset button, make sure that you have a top-notch epilepsy evaluation. Be very clear about the types of seizures you or your child has. Very clear about the type of epilepsy or the epilepsy syndrome. And ensure that a cause is identified or that an adequate and appropriate search for the cause has been conducted. I'm guessing in this audience, we're really talking about duplication 15q. You guys have got that information already. The second thing is to make sure that prior medication trials were appropriate and that your impression of conventional medication failure is because those medications weren't working and not because they were poorly chosen or not administered at a correct dose. A lot of times, patients will show up in clinic and they've tried 5 medications, but none of them were at an adequate dose, and perhaps 3 of them were not indicated for their specific type of seizure or specific type of epilepsy. Number 3, get a second opinion. I think a lot of people are fearful about offending their providers. I would say that I am usually glad when someone gets a second opinion because half the time they come back with some good ideas that I hadn't thought of. So don't be shy about this and expect to get very different opinions because a lot of these forms of epilepsy are managed with great difficulty and there are a variety of approaches out there. So don't be put off if you get vastly different opinions. Just be grateful that you're getting a lot of information about different options to move forward. And then the big thing is to minimize risk. We want to make sure that patients who are using these products are doing it appropriately, that they have had a decent trial of conventional medications that are known to be effective for their epilepsy syndrome. In general, if there's a clinical trial that fits your kid, I would say go for the clinical trial because these are higher quality, consistent products that are not subject to month-to-month variation, that won't vary with weather or fertilizer or soil constituents, will not have risks of soil or fungal or other infectious contamination. Make sure you do your homework and look for drug interactions. That's something that, unfortunately, parents need to be looking out for because a lot of practitioners are not aware of these interactions. And as best you can, know the product. Check it independently. Go to one of these companies that provides these services. Even though it is at great cost, it could be, potentially life-saving if you can identify a big change in this product. When we have patients who are doing well on therapy, the last thing we want them to do is stop their product cold turkey. But if you have variation in your product such that last month it was a good concentration and that this month there's no cannabidiol, that would be an opportunity to create withdrawal seizures, which could be dangerous or even fatal. So if it's possible, test these products frequently, every bottle. Among the safety concerns with cannabidiol, the chief things of concern are liver function. We've seen quite a few patients who have had elevation in liver enzymes, and that there's some concern that cannabidiol may suppress the immune system to some extent and may reduce certain blood cell counts, especially white blood cell counts. So these should be monitored at least monthly or slightly less than that after longer-term use. But I would emphasize that this is still the Wild West. We don't know the true safety profile, and we have to keep an open mind about whether new events of concern are potentially linked to cannabidiol. And then, like any therapy, if an adequate trial of cannabidiol or any other therapy is unsuccessful, you got to move on. I've seen too many cases where parents have given medical marijuana or cannabidiol a fair shake, that they've tried it for several months, it's not successful, but parents and patients are persevering despite reason that they need to move on and try another therapy. Okay, so let's stop there and maybe open it up for some questions.
Okay, what is your view of the entourage effect? And I apologize if you already addressed that.
I'm sorry, what's my view of what effect?
The entourage effect?
Yes, okay. So there's a variety of data suggesting that it's not just one chemical of the marijuana plant that is doing the hard work, and that it is multiple chemicals, things like a combination of cannabidiol and THC, or a combination of cannabidiol with other chemicals like terpenes in the plant. Unfortunately, there are no good studies really verifying this. There are some suggestive data when it comes to the more conventional effects of marijuana or recreational marijuana, but this has not been demonstrated in the treatment of epilepsy. So I would say we should keep an open mind, and we should certainly investigate the potential that there is an entourage effect. But based on what we see now, it looks like products that are pure cannabidiol have some potential to work. And it's still early, but it looks like products that are community sourced that have a combination of CBD and THC may also be effective. So I'd say the jury's out. Anyone who says that it's definitely the entourage effect, and anyone who says it's definitely just cannabidiol, I wouldn't trust them because no one knows yet.
You know, we went to Harborside in Northern California, which is one of the most known clinical places to go. And we went there, and the person behind the counter was trying to tell us what to do for our daughter. We told him what all the symptoms were and all those things. And I looked at this guy, and I said, do you have a PhD? Do you have an MD? Did you graduate from high school? And he's telling me how much we should give to my child. So that's my problem with all of the medical marijuana is that, I don't want to be rude, but at the same time, who is a good practitioner to go to that can look at, I have Lamictal, my daughter's on guanfacine, and now I want to try to add this, but how much, when, interactions with my other drugs, all those things that you brought up, which for me, because I'm a lawyer, I usually go by the book and look at these things. It doesn't have FDA approval. How do you do all of this?
Yeah, that is a very tough question. There are certainly a lot of charlatans out there. A lot of folks who, there are a lot of people who are well-meaning, who have done a lot of internet research and think they know what's going on, but there is not enough acknowledgement that there's a lot of uncertainty here. You get a lot of conventional MD practitioners who are confident that this stuff doesn't work, and I kind of cringe when I see that because everyone should be pretty modest in their understanding of what's going on here. I think we need to recognize that there's a big need for new therapies, and we have to recognize that there is limited but hopeful data suggesting that cannabidiol is effective. But you got to be careful. My advice to patients is to stick with some of the name brand, so to speak, producers who have been making more product and have more of at least a limited establishment of making these products. Places like CW Botanicals, Charlotte's Web, Miriam's Hope, Haley's Hope. I can't really endorse any of these products specifically, but we've seen it work in at least rare cases. So I would say go with a popular brand, even though it might not be safe and it might not be effective. But foremost, I would make sure that you are engaging your neurologist. You can't, as tempting as it is, and sometimes out of desperation, you feel like you have to do this on your own, and that should not be the case. I think you have to find a practitioner who is open-minded and who has done a little bit of homework and is at least familiar with what limited data is out there. And I know folks like that are hard to find, and there are a lot of different viewpoints out there. But I would say keep getting different opinions until you find someone you're comfortable with. But foremost, keep in mind these approaches to minimize risk.
Hi, I'm wondering how long you think it will be until it's sort of more regulated and the trials are all done and there's much more known about it.
I'm not sure if I understood that, but I believe the question was how long do I think it'll be until a cannabidiol product is approved or clinical trials will be done? If that isn't the correct question, correct me afterward, but it's a good question. And the answer is I don't know. My hope is that existing studies are on the right track and that they will be demonstrating real benefit, but this is unknown. I'm hopeful that clinical trials will pan out and that maybe by the end of the year we'll have something. It's also possible that the limited data we have right now is misleading and that cannabidiol is not nearly as effective as we think, and maybe it's not safe, and it's possible that these products will never be approved.
So recently at my daughter's neurology appointment, I asked her neurologist, about CBD and where that was going and his hope for that. And he said that he was actually more hopeful in a new drug that had just been approved called fenfluramine. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Okay, so this is probably more pertinent to a disorder called Dravet syndrome, which is caused by a sodium channel gene mutation. And Dravet syndrome has been the focus of several new drugs, among them cannabidiol, but the other one is fenfluramine. And it is a drug that is actually related to, I don't know if you've heard of fen-phen, but there was a weight loss drug, a combination drug 20 years ago, that was linked to heart problems and aortic valve problems. There were several fatalities. But it turns out that in low doses, there is some promising data that is effective at least for the control of seizures associated with Dravet syndrome. And there is an ongoing clinical trial. As far as I know, it is not approved, but maybe I'm just behind the ball. Maybe this just happened. But I would expect that there's still a ways to go before that drug is expanded to other types of epilepsy. And I'm concerned that it might be Dravet syndrome specific. So certainly not at the top of my list, and I am unfortunately not as hopeful regarding that drug.
Hi, you had mentioned that that CBD isn't pure. It does have some THC in it, because I had gotten some CBD and I was told it was 100% CBD. Is that incorrect information, or could it have been 100% CBD?
My guess is that that was incorrect. When you think about community-sourced extracts, by and large, these extracts are produced by breeding plants that produce a lot of CBD and that produce very little THC. But it is impossible with current technology to breed the THC out of the plant completely. You know, the purest extracts, so to speak, have a ratio of approximately 25 to 1, meaning for every 1 part of THC, there are 25 parts of CBD. So these are close to pure. Maybe you could say that they're about 95% CBD, but it's not pure. And who knows, maybe you actually need a little bit of THC, or maybe you need more than that. The only products that I would view as pure would be those that are produced in the pharmaceutical realm, either synthetic products like Cannabidiol oral solution, manufactured by Insys Therapeutics, which is only available in clinical trials, and Epidiolex, which is a plant-derived CBD product that is 99% CBD.
I thought if there were other sort of epilepsy-related questions, we can also field those. I think one comment that I want to make that I'm sure Sean will agree with, and he sort of commented on it during his talk, is that the most important thing is that you're open with your provider about the CBD use, because many of us have many patients on it, and while we may not know exactly what the interactions are or what the right dose is, we can be informed that you're taking it, and then, do our homework, as Sean said, with regards to what interactions might be, because we're learning more all the time. Different institutions have different policies around how tolerant, if you will, they are of CBD. For instance, if your child's admitted to the hospital, about whether they can take it in the hospital or not. But in general, it's very important that we know. And I do find that a lot of patients will come, for instance, to see me in clinic. I'm sure it's true for Sean as well, where for a long time they haven't felt comfortable telling their providers that they're taking any kind of alternative treatments, because they feel as though they'll be kind of somehow chastised or penalized for that. And that's our problem. That's the practitioner's problem. Meaning we should never make you feel like you're doing something that you shouldn't feel comfortable telling us about, because the most important thing is safety, and we can't help you and your child be safe if we don't know, if we don't have all the facts. And so please feel comfortable giving, and if your provider does not feel comfortable taking care of your child because of the addition of CBD, then that's a choice that together you can make. But telling us is really important, because as Sean said, we're learning that things like Onfi or clobazam have specific interactions that need to be monitored, and we didn't know that a year ago or maybe 2 years ago. So I think that's a big take-home point. But are there any questions just about epilepsy management, just because I know that's an issue that many of you face on a daily level, or a daily basis?
Sean, do you want to stay on, or should I let you go? Okay, never mind. Can you stay on, or should I let you go?
I've got a couple minutes.
Okay.
Hi, my question is specific to Keppra and CBD. We noticed when we followed the Duke 15 clinic's advice to drop Keppra completely off and double the dose of CBD, which was not what we wanted to do, we noticed that we went from 2 seizure types to 6 seizure types again, and infantile spasms are back. So what I noticed was we went 2 or 3 months of no seizures with a tiny dose of Keppra and a tiny dose of CBD, that it was the small entourage carry. So I'm curious if there is any if there's any data tracking or any sort of conversation about using a combination for the therapy?
Sure. So I would first say that there is, one strategy when one medication is not working is that you shouldn't necessarily abandon it and try a different medication. And that there are many cases in which a blend of multiple low-dose medications can give you effectiveness with fewer side effects. And that may certainly be true with cannabidiol, but it's largely unknown. I suspect that cannabidiol may work well with clobazam or onfi, but I'm really not sure. And there's not good data for any other drug combination with cannabidiol. As far as we know, there's not a quantitative interaction between cannabidiol and Keppra or levetiracetam, but we don't really know. There have not been systematic studies in which patients were randomized to get cannabidiol with low-dose Keppra or with high-dose Keppra, so we really don't know. And unfortunately, I hear your personal anecdote. I've kind of heard a million other anecdotes, and I'm not sure if there is any kind of data to wash out there. So I would say these sorts of studies definitely need to be done, but keep an open mind at this point.
I have a very broad question. When you were talking about infantile spasms, you said that milder seizures are associated with bigger cognitive harm, and I assume you're just talking about spasms with that, not mild seizures versus big seizures in general. But what I'm wondering is, I think we all have this idea that seizures are harming our kids, and personally, I don't understand how that works. Can you explain what the mechanism is by which the seizures are doing harm, and why, for instance, hypsarrhythmia is worse than other patterns? Yeah, that's my question. Sorry.
I can certainly comment on it. It's an easy answer. I don't know. What we definitely know, though, is that it is very bad for you, and that there is something about hypsarrhythmia or this excessive connectivity in the brain that disrupts normal cognitive function, that it can not only arrest development, but in many cases can cause a regression, such that kids who have accumulated certain skills or abilities are losing those skills and abilities rather quickly when hypsarrhythmia emerges. And it's also not quite clear what contribution hypsarrhythmia has and what contribution that spasms have in the absence of hypsarrhythmia. So these are actually chief aims of our laboratory, trying to figure out what is the relative importance of these two things, and if there is some way to go about the therapy to eliminate both.
My question is related to, and I think it kind of piggybacks a little bit off of the last question of side effects of the medications versus the seizures themselves, and control in there versus how much, versus heavy medication that could cause really intense side effects.
I have to apologize. I couldn't make out most of that.
Okay, so my question is related to the controlling seizures versus side effects of the medication, and kind of finding that balance and how we could kind of go about doing that in the best way.
Got it. It's a very important and very tough question. I would say that each of these individually is not the goal, that you can't just get seizure freedom but have a drug with terrible side effects. I can think of many patients who finally achieved seizure freedom but were so unhappy or so unhealthful because of the side effects that they were experiencing. For example, you can think about Keppra. Keppra is notorious for causing aggressive behavior or irritability, and we've seen a lot of patients who, even on small doses, became immediately seizure-free, but their behavior was so bad that the parents would trade away that seizure freedom for good behavior. And I think that neurologists or practitioners look at this very different than patients and parents. So certainly, if you are concerned about the side effects, you make it abundantly clear to your neurologist that the impact of those side effects is just as big as the impact of the seizures. In general, there's no one strategy that fits every patient, but certainly keep shuffling the deck. Try different dosages, try different combinations, and don't be beholden to any one drug. Just because you found a drug that works doesn't mean you have to stay on that medication.
I had another question about the clinical trials. So I'm unclear as how are UCLA and other institutions doing clinical trials, and because it's still federally illegal. So how does that work with those trials? And then trying to come up getting, I guess, are you using synthetic cannabinoids? Because I know that that's the big problem, is that we can't get some really good clinical trials with FDA approval and all those things because it's still a federal Class A1 drug.
Okay, so all of the formal clinical trials, and by that I mean studies in which patients are randomized to receive cannabidiol or placebo, these are all using pharmaceutical products that are pure or nearly pure cannabidiol. They are kind of high-quality products that have good shelf life, good consistency, but they are not combination products, so they do not have any meaningful THC content. The clinical studies that have looked at community-sourced CBD extracts that do have some THC have been observational in design, meaning that we did our best to keep track of patients, but we did not specifically intervene. We did not specifically assign patients to a given product or a given dose of product. And these are much lower quality studies, unfortunately. And this really points to this question of the entourage effect. If the entourage effect is real and it has pertinence to pediatric epilepsy, we are not in a good position to identify it. The way to look at that would be to study patients who were getting pure cannabidiol and compare them to patients who were getting the same amount of cannabidiol and a little bit of some other chemical from the plant. But that particular study design is still illegal in the United States. There have been efforts to do these studies in other countries. There have been efforts on our part to run these studies in other countries, but we have not yet been successful. And unfortunately, there is still a mountain of legal hurdles and other procedural obstacles to making those studies happen. And we are also advocating in the legislature, both within the state and nationwide, trying to open those doors to research. It's just a situation where it's pretty nonsensical. I mean, I think if you sit down with any senator or congressman, within 5 minutes you can convince them that this is a worthy thing to study and that we should, break down these barriers. But at the same time, when those folks kind of float these ideas to the people who fund their campaigns and vote for them, there is a lot of skepticism about the potential of cannabidiol and medical marijuana in the community at large. And we really need to change that stigma and that view. I mean, I think there's a lot of promise in this drug, and we have to get that message out.
So what you just said brought up a question I had earlier, and then I have another question, subsequent question. But the question from earlier was, is there a letter for parents available that we can, like a template, that we could customize to send to our senators and legislators about this issue? Because if that was put up on the Dupe 15Q website or available through UCLA, I think it would be much easier for parents to pull it up, fill it out, and mail it on. So that was my first question. And then my second question has to do with hypsarrhythmia. My daughter has modified hypsarrhythmia, and I'm just wondering what is the kind of outcome, the look for the outcome or the difference between a child with hypsarrhythmia and a child with modified hypsarrhythmia?
Got it. So I'll address the first question. There are a variety of templates that are out there. A lot of organizations, especially purveyors of medical marijuana, have engaged in this process and tried to engage the legislature on a federal level. Also, the Epilepsy Foundation has tried to advocate. And so far it has been of to no avail. But I certainly wouldn't stop you. I think the best place to go would be the Epilepsy Foundation of America. And they really work with many different patient groups with different types of epilepsy, all of whom are hoping that cannabidiol or related products may be a promising avenue. But unfortunately, I'm a little bit pessimistic about that process. I think we need to keep working at it. But I think, in addition to patients and parents, investigating those avenues, it's really incumbent upon practitioners and researchers to push that agenda, and that we need to keep an open mind about what sorts of products, whether they are combination products with THC or whether it's pure cannabidiol, and we have to, work as quickly in tandem and at the same time to investigate these products. So in short, there's no one template, but there are many out there, and the best place to go would be Epilepsy Foundation of America. With regard to your second question, hypsarrhythmia also comes in several flavors, and there is what is called classic hypsarrhythmia, which is like that one slide that I showed you with the chaotic brainwaves. There are also many variations of this pattern, and those variations have been termed atypical, variant, or modified hypsarrhythmia, but they're all basically the same. If your practitioner is invoking the term hypsarrhythmia of any sort, they are indicating that the EEG is very abnormal and that there is an ongoing process that has the potential to harm a patient's development. So quite clearly, you can't keep going with any amount of hypsarrhythmia. You have to persevere to eliminate it completely.
This question is more related to seizure management and I guess more seizure diagnosis. There seems to be a bit of a black art involved with the EEG. I've had times where my son, I've really thought he's having seizures and we catch the movements on the EEG and it's a normal EEG. And then other times where there appears to be nothing and he has an abnormal EEG. And I'm wondering if you have just any shreds of enlightenment to share.
Tough question. So I think the first thing to distinguish is whether the EEG is normal or abnormal during seizures and whether it's normal or abnormal in between seizures. There are many cases in which the appearance of brain waves can fluctuate. This can happen minute to minute, hour to hour, and certainly day to day. So I can imagine a single patient having a 24-hour EEG today, and then a week from now having another 24-hour EEG, and those could be pretty different. And that very much depends on the frequency of your seizures, and it depends on the kind of epilepsy that you have. So I know, for example, in the case of infantile spasms, I believe that there's considerable variation day to day. But when these sorts of discrepancies happen, I think you really need to pin down your practitioner and make them explain to you what's going on. A lot of times we're very quick to quickly summarize the EEG, and the way that we summarize the EEG varies very much between practitioners. The other point is that seizures can be very subtle. In some cases, the actual movement can be easy to miss, and also the changes that we see on EEG with seizures can be easy to miss. And there are many cases in which a seizure might be obvious from someone's behavior, but almost invisible or invisible on the EEG. And vice versa, there are so-called subclinical seizures in which the seizure is only seen on the EEG and not associated with any behavior. And I would say that seizures that of any sort pose some risk, especially those associated with infantile spasms and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome.
Which is that I think Sean's point is really important about the fact that, and I mentioned it in my talk earlier today, which is that EEG is like a videotape of the brain. It's a dynamic imaging tool, if you will, and the brain is there's constantly changing systems happening. The way the neurons are firing, that's changing all the time. And so an EEG can look very different at different times, but that's actually also why we really try, especially in kiddos with DU15Q syndrome where they're at high risk for seizures and the seizures can be very subtle, we really try to recommend an overnight EEG rather than a 40-minute snapshot, because a 40-minute snapshot often does not capture baseline abnormalities that may be important to capture, and it certainly won't capture subtle spells that might be concerning. So we always recommend, as a clinics consortium, we've actually been recommending a yearly baseline 24-hour EEG, or overnight EEG at least, so we can capture sleep and just get more information during the day as well. I know that's hard to get done in certain sites, and we're kind of working to help different sites around the country make that a more standard protocol, if you will. But oftentimes I see patients where they've had a 20-minute or a 40-minute EEG and they've been told it's normal, and that doesn't really help us a lot when we're trying to manage the epilepsy.
Very quick question for you. Is there any conclusive evidence that some of the known commercial drugs, positively interact or are counterindicated with the use of CBD? And would there be a list of medications that definitely should be treated with caution when, undertaking a CBD treatment.
I could make out some of that, but I believe the question was, is there a list somewhere that shows all of the interactions that are known? That's a good question, and that is something that I can put up on my website, the Infantile Spasms Project, and I will get it up there in the next day. But I'm not aware of any particular public site that has a listing of the latest data on this.
Thank you.
On the other hand, I do want to caution you not to depend on the internet too much for this, and make sure that your practitioner has tried to go to the medical literature and search for these things themselves, because it's hard to come up with a comprehensive list.
So this is a general seizure management question. Our daughter started on Lamictal when she was in middle school, gave her great control for a while. She lost that control, and Dr. Thibert recommended Vimpat. We once again got great control, and we're at the max Lamictal at the max Vimpat. So as we're starting to see she lost control, we got it a little bit back by really addressing her constipation. But if that deteriorates again, at what point do you say, okay, let's try a third anticonvulsant versus, okay, let's start over? Like, just generally, what is the wisdom about piling on more versus just let's start over?
It's a great question. Sean, go first.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there is no consensus about how this should be done. My own approach is that I don't like patients to be on more than 3 medications. And, for example, if you're on 2 medications and you think you've got the most benefit that you can get out of it, I would generally go to whatever we think was the best dose of those 2 medications that had the best balance of seizure control and side effects. Sit on that dose, measure the blood level of those drugs, and then cautiously add a 3rd medication at a low dose, and slowly increase it and see if you can further improve that balance of side effects and seizure control. And at the same time, keep an eye on the blood level of the first 2 drugs and make sure that what you think is the balance going forward is still maintained. And this actually goes back to drug interactions. When we talk about drug interactions that we know, these are usually 2-way interactions where we know what is happening with 2 drugs. But if you're on 3 drugs or 5 drugs, or 5 anti-seizure drugs and 5 other medications for other things, then those types of interactions are completely unknown, and we have to be very cautious.
Yeah, and the other comment I would make, and I'm sure Sean, even though he sees a lot of young ones, sees this as well, which is that we often see patients who are older who come with, they come carrying their history, and they're on many anti-epileptics that have just never been taken off because they were effective at some point. And I think at that point, we do sometimes take a step back and think about what each of those medications is truly targeting, because epilepsy changes over time as well. The type of seizure changes. They might move from a more generalized epilepsy to something that's more, partial or has a more focal onset, and that requires a different kind of medicine. So that's why having kind of constant monitoring and maybe doing more routine EEGs can be also helpful, because it is an issue, especially with some of our older patients who have seen multiple specialists. I see patients who come to me for the first time who are literally taking 5 anti-epileptics, and they haven't seized in a long time, and we don't know, is it because of this regimen of 5 medications, or is it one that's really doing the trick? And so we have to be mindful of that also.
Okay, I unfortunately have to get off the line, but it's been a pleasure speaking with you guys. Thanks for your attention, and I wish you all luck.
Thank you, Sean. And I will say it, I know as parents it's frustrating when oftentimes our answer is, we don't know, but here's what we do. And it's in pediatric epilepsy in particular, it's, we have good data on the effects of medications in kind of simple, straightforward epilepsies. And we have good data on, the kind of pharmacology of these and what we call pharmacokinetics and dynamics, meaning how do these drugs behave in the blood and whatnot in very simple cases. A lot of these sort of simple cases get thrown out the window with patients with Dravet and other types of, more complex epilepsies. These kids often have very hard to manage epilepsies, and I know many of you in the room know that. I, as a physician who takes care of these kids, know that. And we then do end up relying on experience and guidance from other people who have seen maybe similar situations. And it doesn't end up being evidence-based as much as maybe it's evidence-based in a different way. It's not based on studies, it's based on someone having seen 3 patients with the same issues. And so I know as a parent that's frustrating because it doesn't feel very scientific. And for us, it's hard also. But the main thing that we really try to do, and I think Dr. Hussein or Sean did a good job of really emphasizing this, is we try to be as sort of logical in our process and careful in our process, where for me, for instance, I never make more than one change at once. So if we're gonna try a new medicine, then we're not gonna change doses of anything else in the background, even if the goal is to get off one med and on another. We were not gonna do that at the same time, because if there's side effects, if there's breakthrough seizures, we won't know what's actually contributing to that change. So we have to be patient and do things stepwise and take good data and notes. And that's why some of these apps that some of my patients use, like Seizure Tracker, are really helpful, because I love Seizure Tracker because I can see a spreadsheet of how did the seizures change over, a week-long period. Sometimes we don't realize it when we're seeing our child day to day, but when you look at the data at a macro level, it's very helpful to see patterns and see when things might have improved. And so we really try to take kind of a data-driven approach, but it's challenging.
So Dr. Jesse, I have a question.
Yeah.
We actually, we consider ourselves very lucky because his seizures are managed.
Great.
He actually had a breakthrough seizure almost at the 2-year mark, and we kind of adjusted the medication and started again. And while I know the idea is to get him eventually off the seizure medication, it terrifies me to the core. He's 11, so now puberty is coming and that sort of thing. So is there evidence to support to keep the medication even if you get past the 2-year and there hasn't been any breakthroughs? Again, especially with the onset of puberty and that sort of thing. Or is the go-to, he's controlled, let's get off the med and see what happens? So
right. It's a good question. So that 2-year sort of magic number is based on many, many studies in pediatric epilepsy. It's not based on studies in children with genetic syndromes that confer an incredibly high risk for seizures through a lifespan. So that 2-year mark is based on studies that have shown that if a child with it's funny, we say idiopathic epilepsy now with genetics. We know that almost nothing's idiopathic. We know about the genetics of epilepsy. We know a lot about it, like we didn't, even 10 years ago. But in sort of non-syndromic forms of epilepsy, what we find is that if a child is well controlled on medications for 2 years, and they have a normal EEG, the likelihood that they're going to be seizure-free for the long run is high. And so at that time, at the 2-year point, we can think about weaning off the medicine, and that's really what it's based on. It does not apply to children with Dravet syndrome. Now, if I have a family who says, I really want to be off meds, they've been seizure-free, they're doing great, I'm worried about side effects, most of us are up for trying with close monitoring if the EEG, at baseline is normal. But in general, my approach, and I think that this is true with most of the epilepsy specialists, is that we would be very loath to take children off of antiepileptics if they're working. And, you bring up puberty, that's really, so there's, in general in pediatric epilepsy, there's 2 peaks of seizures. One is in infancy and one is in adolescence. In DUP15Q, that's not quite the case. We do see a big peak with the spasms, but we see another big peak, if you will, in early childhood, and then certainly in adolescence as well. And so adolescence is definitely a time where children are at risk for seizures. So we try to protect them as much as possible. And the way I look at this is that of course it's not fun to take a medicine every day, and of course there's the potential for side effects, but I look at it as our goal is to try to minimize risk and optimize outcomes for these kids. And we know that controlling seizures is one of the ways to optimize outcomes, whatever those may be. And so if a medication is working, then again, from the clinician standpoint, it's hard to justify taking that off if everything is otherwise going well. Again, if there are side effects, it's another issue. And sometimes around puberty, we have to think about changing medicines because certain medicines cause more weight gain, which is more of a risk during puberty or whatever that may be. And so we might make some changes from that standpoint.
This may be just asking the same question over again in
Yeah,
a
no
different
problem.
way, or one that's been asked already, and the challenge is understanding what controlled means, and I mean, for 31 years now, I've been worrying about, well, does every seizure do harm? And that we reached a point about Rachel's 31 when she was 20 where she couldn't walk, and she was, because the side effects were so bad. So he said, and we never got to zero. Never got to less than a seizure a day, probably at that point. And so for that we've been living with, well, it's only a few a week. That feels okay. At least she's walking and eating and stuff, as opposed to not doing any of those things. Is that everybody's different? You got to just take your chances and see what happens.
And I think that every child or adult has their own baseline, and for all of us, our goal is to have every child completely seizure free. And that is the goal. Does it always happen? Unfortunately, no. And so then the goal is, how do we get to a place where we have maximized the effectiveness of medications and minimized side effects in a way that is promoting development. So some of the things that I look for, to answer your question, is I look at and it's partly because I focus on development and neurodevelopmental outcomes, but that's what's important for all of us as well, right? So I look at the other areas. So I don't just count the seizures. I ask, how is their adaptive living? How are they doing developmentally? Are they making gains? If a child's having a seizure a day that's short, but they're making developmental gains, and that seizure a day is actually less than what they normally would have, and their side effects aren't terrible, we might, together, meaning the family and I, might agree that that's an okay baseline. So it does depend a little bit on the child, but I think in the backdrop, what we're looking for are other metrics that the seizures are not negatively impacting other areas of functioning. And I think the question that Brittany asked earlier, which is a really good one, about when is it bad to have seizures? And the answer is, it's true. We don't know exactly. There's some data about having really prolonged seizures, meaning more than 10 minutes, can have more negative consequences. But the reality is, the reason that we think that seizures affect development are twofold. One is, when a child is actually having a generalized seizure, they're not engaged with their environment. So it affects the way they learn. Because they're, if there's then a postictal period and they're sleepy or whatnot, it affects that. So it can affect learning, and it affects experience. So that's one. And then secondly, when you think about the EEG, again, the EEG is a picture of essentially firing of neurons and synchrony. And it's really, I think of it as like an imaging tool to look at how the brain is connected and functioning. And as we grow cognitively, as we experience our environment and our brain absorbs that and then creates brain networks, all of that is done, that whole process of like learning from your environment and then having your brain develop in response to that, that's all done through generating and developing these connections in the brain. And when you look at an EEG like that is hypsarrhythmia, you can imagine that kind of synchronous firing of neurons and that forming of those healthy connections is just not happening as well. It's disrupting that basic process of brain development that we would like to happen. Is it irreversible? Well, no. As we said, if when you look at the EEG, it changes all the time. So those things can absolutely be improved, with medications or with time or whatnot. But we think that it's actually partly just that incredibly abnormal firing of neurons that also affects brain function and can affect cognition and things like that.
My question's kind of a combo of these two. And then to add on, we're at the point where we've added 2 medications. We're at very high doses. She's only 4. We've only been doing this for a year. We've been told that she has the refractory epilepsy that's possibly not going to ever be solved with medication completely. I've seen some contradicting things online that may not actually be a thing, that it may just be that it's not being treated correctly. But the medicines, when they're working, they do work. Then she finds a way to break through, and then we up it and we add. But we're only a year in. So I guess we're good with we just have 1 or 2 a week, and then when we start having 20 a day again, we call, they up it. But we're maxed right now. So when we get to the point where medicine just doesn't work anymore, or there's nothing else we can add, what are our options?
So 2 answers. One, and I'll just say that just from a definition standpoint, the standpoint of what refractory means. So by definition, a medically refractory epilepsy just means that a child has failed 3 medicines or a combo thereof. It does not actually have a specific sort of prognostic value that they'll never stop having seizures, which is what it sounds like. And I'm sorry that's a very hard message to hear, I'm sure, as a parent. So I'm sorry that you have had to hear that, but it does not mean that the combo of 2 now means that she's going to have seizures forever by any means. So that's one. But secondly, I'll say that it is true that there are some cases, and I would not put your child in that category because, again, you've said she's been on 2 medications, but we do have cases in neurology where we've tried a lot of medications, and there are always more to try. It's unbelievable how many options we have now. I mean, 20 years ago, we had our basic, our little bucket of meds like Depakote and phenobarbital, and then Keppra came out and it changed everything. And now there's, about 30 new agents that are very effective. So there's always options. But I will say sometimes parents get to the point, and clinicians, where we say, we've tried 10 medications, nothing really seems to work. Are there non-medical, non-drug options? And there are, and it really depends on the child. So in some cases, and UCLA actually sees a lot of these patients, there are opportunities for doing epilepsy surgery. There may be one focus in the brain for most of the seizures, and actually going in and doing an ablation or a resection can be helpful. And there are ways to have a workup for that based on the type of seizures and EEG. There's the ketogenic diet, which is another if you will, drug option that can be very effective. Some parents love it. Some parents find it incredibly difficult to maintain because of the dietary interests of the child or whatnot, but that's another option. The vagal nerve stimulator is another one that's a non-drug option. So there are other options, and sometimes families get to that point, and it's not that they're always the last resort. So the keto diet is something that we often find is helpful in some kids, and we can use it in conjunction with medications to help control seizures. But this is where I think I loved that Dr. Hussein said, get a second opinion. And in my case, we have amazing epileptologists at UCLA, so in my complicated epilepsies, I always bring in other troops, to give me guidance, because our goal is not to be Superman or Wonder Woman. We want to help our children get better and do the best by them. And so I think that if you're told something like that, I would recommend getting a second opinion. Bring your info, bring the data, and for all parents, along with Seizure Tracker, the other thing I recommend is, and I try to have my patients do this, is if you can have a chart of in your hands at all times that has every med, when it was started, when it was stopped, what the max dose was, what the side effects were, what the reasons for stopping was. If you have that medication history, it makes our lives so much easier when we see you for the first time, because we already have that whole history in front of us, and we can help sometimes see patterns that someone else didn't see because they were in it. And so having all those data with you ahead of time really helps the folks who are seeing your child for a second opinion.
We can squeeze in one more from back here real quickly, please.
Hi, I know every child is different, but is there one medicine or agent that you've been having the most success with?
For, in general, children with Do15Q?
For Do15Q.
You're so tired of everyone saying every child is different, but I have to say, I'm going to answer it the opposite way, which is I'm going to say that I think for a long time there was a concern or a belief that certain medicines would not work for children with Do15Q, like the benzodiazepines or clobazam or Onfi, because of the GABA receptor overexpression. And I think that what we have found is that that's not the case, and that there aren't medicines that specifically don't work for kids with Do15Q. My approach to patients with Do15Q, which is the same as most of the epilepsy folks, is that we treat the epilepsy, not the syndrome, in the sense that we look at the EEG, we look at the type of seizures. If it's spasms, we'll start with the first line, which, as Dr. Hussein talked about, is ACTH and steroids. We'll go to vigabatrin next. Again, vigabatrin falls in that category of medicines that are GABAergic, that hit the GABA system. And so again, there was a concern for a long time, do these medicines really work? Might they be more harmful? But we know that vigabatrin can work really well. I've had patients who have had a complete reversal of their spasms within a day of starting vigabatrin. So I think I would, again, sort of think of it that way, that we use the traditional meds that we know can work. Sometimes they don't work, but there's no reason to think that they can't. Simply because of the Do15Q.
Okay, thank you. I think we're down to 2:30.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jesse. Appreciate it.
No problem.